Today, we are going to be looking at some really, really interesting material that you sent over to us.
Yeah.
It's from a podcast. It's called Learning English with Lilli and Donald.
Oh, wow.
So, as you can tell from that title alone, it's quite a unique premise for a podcast.
Right.
And what we're going to do today is we're going to dive into some of the transcripts that you sent over, and we are going to pull out some genuinely useful language insights.
Okay.
For you guys listening.
Sounds good.
From everything, like everyday expressions that we use to, more kind of business vocabulary and even political debate phrases.
Right.
And what makes this particularly interesting is, I think, the contrast in styles that we're going to be encountering.
Yeah, definitely. You've given us material featuring Lilli, who's an English coach.
Right.
And a very well-known figure, Donald Trump. And so what's so interesting is that we get to see Lilli trying to present standard English in a very clear way, while Mr. Trump offers his own very distinctive and often exaggerated way of speaking.
Yeah.
This creates a really valuable opportunity, I think, for us to see different communication styles side by side and to understand not just what is being said, but perhaps why it's being said that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And I think that's something that'll kind of come up again and again as we go through this material.
I think so.
So let's just jump right into it.
Okay.
And we're going to start by looking at kind of common English expressions, that are used.
Right.
And the first part of this podcast features Lilli sort of introducing this topic.
Okay.
And almost immediately, Mr. Trump uses a word that seems to be quite a favorite of his.
Right. That's right. The word tremendous comes up very quickly.
Yeah.
And he even defines it for the listener. He says it means very, very good.
Right.
And then he even uses it in a sentence about the podcast itself. He says, this podcast tremendous. And so what's interesting here is to think about the impact of such a strong adjective.
It is strong.
And I think Lilli, acting as the language guide, immediately offers some more common alternatives.
Right.
That learners might hear more frequently, suggesting amazing or fantastic instead.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about this is that Mr. Trump kind of jokingly takes offense to this.
He does. He does.
He says that tremendous is not just good, but it's the best word.
Yeah.
And he even goes on to kind of add these intensifiers, calling it huge, bigly successful.
Right. And this, I think, really highlights how individuals can develop strong attachments to certain words.
Yeah.
And how they believe those words convey a particular impact. Mm-hmm. I think for you as a learner, it raises the question of when such an emphatic choice is effective and when it might be perceived differently.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting how, obviously language is about, like you said, conveying a certain meaning. Mm. But there's also like a feeling behind it and an emphasis behind it.
Yeah.
And, different words, even if they mean the same thing, can sometimes convey very different feelings.
For sure.
Okay, so moving on the podcast, kind of shift the gears a little bit and moves into business and negotiation vocabulary.
Okay.
And obviously, given Mr. Trump's background,
You're right.
This section is quite revealing.
Absolutely. So Lilli kind of smoothly transitions the conversation.
Yeah.
And Mr. Trump kind of offers up some very classic phrases you might hear in a business context.
Right.
So for expressing agreement, he suggests the very simple, it's a deal.
It's a deal.
But then very characteristically, he adds his own flair with, we'll make it huge, clarifying that he means very successful.
Right.
And
of course, Lilli being the English coach here.
Of course.
Gently corrects the pronunciation.
Right.
Huge, yeah.
Back to the standard.
And she also gives a more kind of formal phrase that you might encounter in business negotiations.
Yeah.
Which is, let's discuss the terms.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's interesting here, the contrast in how agreement can be reached, and how it's expressed.
Exactly. And I think what's fascinating is that Mr. Trump's kind of immediate follow-up is to dismiss that formal approach.
Right.
With his very confident statement, we're going to win so much, you'll get tired of winning.
Yeah.
And Lilli's reaction, I think, is quite insightful. She acknowledges it might not be the most practical.
Right.
But definitely memorable.
Right.
And so I think this shows how confidence, even bordering on hyperbole, can play a role in negotiation.
Yeah.
Though it's not a style that fits every situation.
Right.
I think for you, this kind of illustrates the spectrum of formality and the importance of choosing language that's appropriate for the context and your audience.
Yeah, and I think it also makes you really consider when a statement like that might be effective,
right,
and when it might be off-putting to the person that you're talking to.
For sure.
So understanding your audience and the level of formality that's required is so crucial, especially I think in business.
Yeah.
So let's move on to political and debate phrases.
Yeah.
And again, with Mr. Trump's extensive experience in this area, there are likely some interesting examples.
Indeed there are.
So Lilli sort of introduces this section by, referencing Mr. Trump's debate experience.
Yeah.
And his advice is very direct.
It is.
He says, if you don't like a question, the best response is to simply say fake news.
Fake news.
And I think what's so striking here is the dismissive nature of that phrase as a debate tactic.
Yeah, it is.
And Lilli's response is wonderfully understated.
It is. She simply says...
She just says, that's not helpful.
That's not helpful for learners.
For learners.
Which is, I think, just this wonderful understatement.
It's perfect.
And so...
It really highlights the difference between a tactic that's used in a very specific context.
Yes.
And, genuinely helpful advice for someone who's trying to learn effective communication.
Exactly.
And it makes you think about, what is the point of communication? Is it to shut down discussion, or is it to actually engage and persuade?
Right. Is it to win at all costs, or is it to try and reach some sort of understanding?
Exactly.
So very different approaches.
However, Mr. Trump does offer another phrase.
He does.
That's a bit more conventional.
Yes.
In debates, which is, let me tell you something.
Let me tell you something.
And he kind of advises using it before you're about to make a really strong point.
Exactly. And this is actually a fairly common rhetorical device.
Yeah.
I think, if we connect this to the bigger picture of communication, you can see how this phrase functions to signal importance and to grab the listener's attention before a key message.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that you can definitely take away
for sure
and use in many different contexts.
Yeah.
And then Lilli tries to offer a more polite alternative for disagreeing with someone, which is, I respectfully disagree.
But
Mr. Trump's reaction is quite amusing.
It is. He grumbles that it's too weak.
Too weak.
And this, I think really just underscores his preference for a more assertive and less diplomatic communication style.
Exactly.
And I think what's fascinating here is this contrast between directness and diplomacy.
Yeah.
And I think it raises a very important question for you. In what situations might a direct and forceful approach be more effective?
Right.
And when is a more respectful and nuanced approach likely to yield better results?
Exactly. And I think understanding that balance is key to being a really good communicator.
Absolutely.
So to kind of shift gears a little bit and to make it a little bit more interactive for you guys listening.
Yeah.
Lilli introduces a quick quiz segment.
Okay.
Where listeners are invited to correct one of Mr. Trump's sentences.
Okay. I like this.
And I think this is a really clever way to highlight the differences we've been discussing in a more engaging way.
For sure.
So the example sentence that Mr. Trump gives is, the weather is so tremendous today, maybe the best weather ever. Nobody's seen weather like this.
Wow. That's quite a statement.
It's quite a statement, and it's a very characteristic sentence, in its use of superlatives.
Yeah.
And this strong emphasis.
Lots of emphasis.
And Lilli's corrected version is much more concise.
Okay.
And uses more common vocabulary.
All right.
She says the weather's really nice today. Yeah. One of the best days we've had.
Much simpler.
Much simpler. And the difference, I think, is quite noticeable.
Yes, it is.
In terms of the directness and the level of exaggeration.
It really is. And, I think Mr. Trump's mock outrage that his version is more exciting.
Right.
Followed by Lilli's laughter.
Right.
Perfectly captures, I think, the contrasting styles that we've been looking at.
Yeah.
While his language is certainly colorful and memorable, it's not always the most grammatically standard or the most effective, I think, for conveying information clearly and concisely.
Right.
And so for you, this illustrates this trade-off between making a statement that stands out and ensuring that your message is easily understood.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as we kind of bring this deep dive into learning English with Lilli and Donald to a close, What would you say are the main things that you should take away from this exploration?
Well, I think you've had a really unique opportunity to see two very different approaches to using the English language. On the one hand, you have Lilli, who's consistently emphasizing clear, common vocabulary, grammatically sound phrasing.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have Mr. Trump's style.
Right.
Which is, marked by exaggeration,
yes,
frequent use of superlatives, and expressions that are certainly memorable, if not always conventional.
Right. And why is it so important to understand this contrast?
Well, because I think it highlights the incredible range within the English language and the importance of being aware of different communication styles.
Right.
We've seen examples today ranging from the very formal language of business negotiations to the more informal and assertive style used in political discourse.
Right.
And so while some of Mr. Trump's distinctive phrases, might stick in your mind, it's absolutely vital to also develop a strong understanding of standard and polite ways of expressing yourself, particularly in professional or formal settings. Knowing when to opt for a more common word like amazing versus always reaching for a superlative like tremendous is a crucial aspect, I think, of effective communication.
Yeah.
It allows you to tailor your message to your audience in the specific situation.
That's a really key point. So here's something to think about.
Okay.
As you go forward, considering these very different communication styles that we've looked at, how does the specific language that we choose actually shape how our message is received and what kind of impact it has?
Right.
Are there times and places where using very emphatic language like Mr. Trump's use of tremendous might actually be a strategic advantage?
Yeah.
And when might a more understated and perhaps more common word like amazing actually carry more weight and be the more effective choice in getting your message across?
That's a great question to consider.
Yeah, it really comes down to considering who you're talking to, the context of the conversation, and ultimately the specific message that you want to send.
Absolutely.
So that's it for this deep dive.
Great deep dive.
We will see you guys next time.
See you later.